Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We'll start in just a minute or so. We're just waiting for people to join. Hello and welcome. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Hello and welcome. Welcome to today's webinar about offshore wind and transmission infrastructure on California's North Coast. Today's session is sponsored by the Redwood Region Core Hub, which is an initiative of the Humboldt Area Foundation and the Wild Rivers Community Foundation. And we appreciate their collaboration and support. We're hosting this session from Cal Poly Humboldt, which is located in the ancestral territory of the Wiyot people. There are 3 federally recognized tribes in Wiyot ancestral territory, including the Bear River Band of the Ronerville Rancheria, the Blue Lake Rancheria, and the Wiyot tribe. We appreciate all of their leadership, including in areas related to energy innovation and environmental protection. This afternoon, I also want to acknowledge the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, which are located near the San Gorgonio Mountains and the Coachella Valley, for being the first tribal nation in the United States to be co-owners of transmission infrastructure. And I think we'll drop a note about that in the chat. Today we'll focus primarily on transmission infrastructure in relationship to the Humboldt wind energy area, and we'll also briefly discuss transmission infrastructure in Del Norte County. I'll be joined in presenting by my colleague from the Schott Center, Jim Zolik, and I am Arnie Jacobson. So the two of us will be the presenters for today. The topics that we will discuss involve a degree of complexity, and we have a fair amount of material to cover. So we're looking forward to diving in. Before we do that, though, just a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is a 2-hour session, and it will include a 1-hour presentation followed by questions and answers. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and you can enter those questions at any time. If you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat box, and we'll try and help you resolve the problem. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll make it available as a recording later this week on the Schatz Energy Research Center's website, and we'll drop that link in the chat. We look forward to having this discussion with you all. Now, the work that we'll be presenting today draws from a number of different projects and analyses that we've been involved in over the past 5 years. That involves multiple funders and multiple partners. We've shown funders and partners here on the screen, and but of course want to note that the material we're presenting today, any errors or omissions associated with that are our own responsibility and don't reflect on any of these supporters or partners. I'll start off with just a few keynotes, and then we'll dive into the content. I think many of you are aware that the winds offshore from Northwestern California are consistently strong. It's a very windy area once you get a bit offshore from this region. And wind farms in the area could contribute substantially to state and local climate and clean energy goals. And that's why there's a strong interest in offshore wind in this region. However, significant investments in electric transmission infrastructure would be a prerequisite for development of offshore wind at scale in the region. Transmission upgrades could enable regional benefits, including improvements to electricity reliability. Those benefits could be quite significant, but it's also important to note that some communities would not benefit just as a matter of course with those transmission upgrades to support offshore wind, unless there are deliberate measures or deliberate steps taken to ensure inclusive outcomes. And we'll talk a bit about that in this session today. And then I guess just thinking about the infrastructure that we have here in the region, it was established primarily in the post-World War II period, the 2 decades following the Second World War. And the geographic extent and the capacity have not changed substantially since the mid-1960s. Offshore wind could potentially provide a generational opportunity for new infrastructure investment in energy and infrastructure in the region, and that's something that we'll discuss further as well. Now, offshore wind, of course, requires multiple types of new infrastructure, and we see transmission as one of 4 types of infrastructure that would need to be developed if offshore wind farms were to be realized. The 4 big buckets that we see in terms of infrastructure types include the wind farms themselves, ports or marine terminals that are associated with import and export of components, assembly of the systems themselves, as well as subsequently operation and maintenance activities. The electric transmission infrastructure as a third, and as a 4th component, or 4th element, the component supply chains. In the Humboldt region, we would anticipate that 3 of those 4 would necessarily be present in the region as part of offshore wind development at a significant scale, which is the wind farms, the assembly port, and transmission infrastructure. It's possible that there also could be local supply chain manufacturing. That's a possibility, but not a necessity. The component supply chains can be spread out across the globe. Now, each of these 4 components involves its own set of developers and its own set of regulatory and permitting processes. So they're interconnected, but they're also separate in their own way. Each one of them also requires study to understand issues related to environmental, socioeconomic, and cultural resource dimensions, as well as the economics and technological dimensions of each of them. Today, we're going to focus on the transmission infrastructure. We'll discuss both onshore and offshore transmission infrastructure, but we'll have a strong focus on the onshore side of things in today's session. Moving forward into thinking about infrastructure in this region, Humboldt County's electrical system is relatively isolated from the main California grid. This map shows transmission lines, transmission lines that are owned by Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E, are shown in blue on this map. There are also some red lines up here, which are Pacific Power transmission lines, and some gray ones, which are owned by other entities. We also show the Humboldt Wind Energy Area and offshore bathymetry, as well as some marine protected areas. Tribal lands are indicated, and then the red dots are generation sources that are in the region. And we've also noted a couple of key substations out in the upper Sacramento Valley area that will be referenced later in the session. So that's just a bit of orientation on the map. In terms of the electrical system in the region, the use in Humboldt County is concentrated primarily in the Humboldt Bay area, and the average use across the county is on the order of 90 megawatts. To put that in context, California's use as a whole, average use is on the order of 32,000 megawatts, and so Humboldt County's average electricity use is on the order of 0.25% of California's electricity use as a whole. Even though our electricity use is relatively small in this region, the transmission lines that serve our region, there are two 115 kilovolt lines that are shown here on the map that are the primary ones that serve our region, are not large enough to supply either the average load or the peak load for our region. Each of the transmission lines can carry about maybe 75 or so megawatts, and they're meant to be redundant. And so at any given time, the way the system is operated tends not to use more than the capacity of one of them for import of electricity or export at a given time. And so in order for the regional system to work, we need local generation, and the 163 megawatt natural gas fire power plant, which is just south of Eureka and is known as the Humboldt Bay Generating Station, plays this role. It's large enough to carry the peak load for this region on its own, even if those transmission lines were to not be available. And then the major transmission corridors are run more or less along the I-5 corridor, as shown here on the map. And so one possible way of expanding capacity, if there was a need to expand capacity to support offshore wind, would be to connect to that larger infrastructure, although we'll also talk about some other possibilities a little later in the session. Before diving into all of that, I just wanted to give a little bit take a little bit of a detour to just talk about the basic elements of a conventional electrical grid system. So this diagram shows components of it. It shows it set up in sort of a simple linear fashion, which is not actually how transmission systems are set up, but it's a useful way of thinking about the components. So start with the generation stations, which are essentially power plants, which of course produce power for the electrical power for the system. And then transformers are used to convert between lower voltage and higher voltage power. And transformers are typically located in substations. power lines are then used to move power between points of generation and use, and voltage is stepped up to deliver large amounts of power over long distances while minimizing losses. And then the voltage is stepped down for safety reasons as it gets close to the end users. Generation can come from a number of different sources. Fossil fuel power plants, hydropower, nuclear energy power plants, wind, solar, and others. Of course, the portfolio of generation sources affects the environmental implications of the electrical system. So we're often talking about what is the generation portfolio or the mix of generation sources. Although the diagram a couple of slides back showed sort of a linear connection between generation sources and end users, in practice, the system is a fairly complex network of generation sources, transmission and distribution, all eventually connecting to end consumers. In California, ownership and regulation of the electrical system is segmented, with primary owners of the generation being independent power producers, and to a lesser degree these days, the utilities. And in terms of regulation, different regulators play different roles in managing the generation portion of the system, with the California Energy Commission being primarily responsible for siting and associated permitting, the California Public Utilities Commission playing a key role in the operation and safety, and the California Independent System Operator operating the market for electric power and associated services. The transmission lines and associated substations are primarily owned by the utilities, although there are also government agencies such as the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, that own some of the transmission system. And there are also merchant transmission companies, or private companies that are separate from the utilities. And the utilities include a mix of the private sector utilities and also municipal utilities and co-ops. Regulators, the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, is primarily responsible for planning in relationship to the transmission system, and the Public Utilities Commission is responsible for operation and safety related dimensions. And then when it comes to the distribution system, which is closer to the customer end of things, the whole mix of different types of utilities, including the investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, co-ops, and tribal utilities, can own the elements of the distribution system. The California Public Utilities Commission is the primary regulator in that case. And I'll note that this list of owners and regulators is not meant to be fully comprehensive of everyone who's involved, but it does give a sense of the breakdown of responsibilities between some of the different primary regulators and who are the typical owners of this infrastructure. I also want to talk a little bit about differences between AC power and DC power as it relates to the transmission system, because that also relates to some of the upcoming possible decisions associated with transmission development. So the electrical grid is based primarily on alternating current, or AC power. In an alternating current system, the direction and magnitude of the voltage and current change back and forth many times a second. In North America, that's based on a 60 cycle per second or 60 hertz base system. And in a direct current system, the direction of the voltage does not change, and so that's one of the key differences between AC and DC systems. Transformers only work with AC electricity, and so the electrical grid, because of the value of being able to step voltage up to higher voltage and then step it down later using transformers, historically had been based on AC electricity, but somewhat new. I say newish because it's actually a technology that's been around for a number of decades, but is now becoming increasingly deployed. Allows DC voltage to also be used in transmission systems. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about that. High voltage DC or HVDC systems involve AC to DC and DC to AC conversion stations, as well as transmission lines, and they're used to transmit large amounts of power over long distances. The transmission lines in the towers for HVDC systems are less expensive than those for similarly sized AC systems, but the converter stations for HVDC conversion are more expensive than conventional AC-based substations. And so HVDC transmission can be cost-effective compared to AC transmission if the distance that you're trying to deliver the power over is long enough so that the savings from the lower cost transmission lines overcomes the high cost of the converter stations. And so as we talk a bit later in the session, we'll refer back to AC and high voltage DC transmission. And so I just wanted to provide a little bit of background on all of that. I'll also talk through just an example of a high voltage DC transmission line that's relevant in California. There's a HVDC transmission line that delivers Columbia River hydropower to the Los Angeles area. This was a transmission line that was originally built in, I think, in the early 1970s, or commissioned in the early 1970s. And it runs from roughly here on the map. It's this fat purple line that runs all the way down to the LA area. On this map, the fatter lines indicate higher voltage, and so it's the highest voltage line in that image. This image shows that HVDC transmission line, which runs from Celilo to Sylmar. Celilo on the Oregon side and Sylmar in the LA basin. This is in the Greenville area, not too far from Sylmar. And the line on the left is a conventional 230 kilovolt AC transmission line, which has 3 sets of 230 kilovolt lines on a single tower. And I think what's interesting about this picture is that the capacity of the high voltage DC line in this picture is about twice as much as 3 different 230 kilovolt AC transmission lines running to the left of it. And so that highlights one of the advantages of high voltage DC technology. And then this is a picture of the Sylmar conversion station in the LA area. In many ways, it's similar to a large substation, but has different equipment, and that equipment tends to be somewhat more expensive. So one last slide about high voltage DC to just set the stage for the discussion that follows. So high voltage DC lines can carry large amounts of power over a long distance. in a relatively narrow right of way compared to what you would do similarly with AC power. HVDC lines generally don't have many connection points, so communities along the routes are typically not served, but those near the conversion stations can be. And so you might think of HVDC lines as the express bus, which is that they are useful for getting a lot of power from one point to another point, but they don't make stops along the way, typically. And another dimension of high voltage DC lines is that they are able to be used in both an underground and an undersea circumstance. And so you can have long distance undersea or underground HVDC lines. You can have underground or undersea AC transmission lines as well, but you can only do those for typically those are done for tens of miles, but not hundreds of miles, where it is possible to have longer undersea or underground transmission lines that are high voltage DC. I know that's a bunch of information in a short period of time, and we can talk about it during the Q&A as needed. And now what I'd like to do is return to the Humboldt County electrical system, and we'll refer back to some of the information that we just worked through as we proceed to discuss the potential for offshore wind development here on the North Coast and how that relates to transmission. So this is essentially the same slide that I showed before, just to reorient ourselves in the Humboldt County region and the associated electrical system. This map is slightly different than the one I showed earlier, in that some elements are not included, and what's been added are all of the substations, which are shown in these orangish dots. So you have a sense of locations of substations. The electrical system can also be shown schematically, and so this emphasizes both the regional generation sources as well as the main transmission lines. The two 115,000 volt or 115 kilovolt lines, which run and are meant to be redundant to each other, are shown here in green. And then there are also two smaller 60 kilovolt lines, one that runs south to Garberville and beyond down to Laytonville and eventually Ukiah, and then another that runs out roughly along the parallel to the 115 kilovolt line out into the Trinity area. And those 60 kilovolt lines are really meant to serve communities along the way. They're not so much meant for import and export of power into and out of the Humboldt Bay area. As I mentioned earlier, the anchor power plant for the region is the 163 megawatt natural gas fueled Humboldt Bay generating station. And that's shown here in this image. This is located just to the south of Eureka and just to the east of the harbor entrance. It is a natural gas power plant, and it depends primarily on gas delivered from the Red Bluff area via a single 12-inch pipeline. They do have some the engine generators that make up this power plant can run on natural gas, but also can run on diesel fuel. And so they do have some on-site diesel and storage tanks, and they hold fuel for about 3 days of operation at full power. I think the storage tanks is located here. It probably wouldn't need to operate at full power. It'd probably operate closer to the average power. So in practice, there's probably 5 or 6 days of on-site operational fuel stored at the site. Other key infrastructure in the region are the 215 kilovolt substations. There is one at the Humboldt Bay generating station, and the other is the Humboldt substation, which is located in the Mitchell Heights area of Eureka. So I'll just pause there for a second and note that all of this infrastructure is as I'd mentioned earlier, was established essentially in that period from 1946 to 1965. And I'll spend just a couple of seconds talking through the history of that infrastructure, which I think is relevant to how we're thinking about it today. So Pacific Gas and Electric made major investments to expand the electrical and gas infrastructure in the region during the post-World War II period. That included a lot of investment in expanding the electrical generation capacity in the region, including building a natural gas power plant and a nuclear power plant at the site of the current power plant. The original natural gas power plant and the nuclear power plant were built in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and the current version of the power plant was built and replaced those original power plants that was built maybe 15 years ago or so, or commissioned maybe 15 years or so ago. And the current installed generation capacity here in the region is a little bit higher, but only moderately higher than the installed generation capacity that was in place as of 1965. Additionally, the geographic extent and the capacity of the transmission lines and the substations also expanded substantially between 1946 and 1965, but have not changed substantially since then. There have been upgrades and replacements, but the geography and the overall capacity has not changed that much. One example of upgrades that are recent is that PG&E has invested quite a bit in changing out wooden transmission poles for steel poles as a hardening effort or an effort to make the electrical system less vulnerable to wildfire. So there certainly have been investments. Another example is the Arcata substation was upgraded about a decade ago. And there are other examples of incremental changes, but not substantial ones. Natural gas infrastructure also expanded in the 1950s and 60s, with the natural gas power plant and the timber mills being major consumers of the gas. This table shows dates of when all of the various substations in the region were established. These were dates that were identified through archival newspaper research. And as you'll see, all of the ones that are shown in this yellowish color were established between 1945 and 1959. There are a couple that were installed in the first half of the 1960s, and only one that was established since then, which is the substation at the Ultra Power biomass plant in Blue Lake, which was established in the mid-1980s. And so all of the rest of the infrastructure was essentially established, or the sites of the substations were established between 1946 and 1965. And in terms of the natural gas infrastructure, there's a single 12-inch natural gas pipeline that runs from the Red Bluffish area over to the Humboldt Bay area. That was installed in 1958. There is some natural gas production in this region. Gas was discovered at Tompkins Hill in 1937, and that gas field was developed, and that was the original source of natural gas in the region. And that gas field is still producing, and it currently produces something on the order of 10% of the natural gas used in the region. But this pipeline is what provides nearly all of the rest of the gas in the region. And again, that was established in this late 1950s, early 1960s time period. All of that activity, I think, it's useful to put into context of what else was happening in the region. This is the graph that shows Humboldt timber production from 1860 to 2022 in millions of board feet. And so you can see that there was a significant or massive increase, really, of timber production in the post-World War II period, which has since declined. And the major expansion of electrical and gas infrastructure in Humboldt County occurred in that ramp-up period and during that period when timber production was peaking. Just a few reflections on this historical dimension. So significant investments in electrical and natural gas infrastructure in Humboldt County occurred during the post-World War II economic boom. This is a time when the region's timber resources were in high demand to support economic development across California and beyond. Investments in new infrastructure since then have been comparatively modest. As I mentioned, there have been replacements and some upgrades, but in terms of significant new expansion of infrastructure, there hasn't been all that much. Offshore wind represents a potential opportunity for investment in new infrastructure, including investments that could bring benefits from a reliability, from a capacity, and from an employment perspective to the region. But that has to be thought about in context of other implications of this infrastructure expansion. I want to spend just a couple of minutes also talking about the Del Norte County transmission system. We haven't done nearly the level of analysis associated with the Del Norte system as we have with the Humboldt system, so this will be a briefer overview, but we have done some thinking and analysis. Like Humboldt's system, the electrical system serving Del Norte County is relatively isolated. Del Norte County is shown here on the map, and the power operator in the region is Pacific Power, which is shown on this map with the red colored lines. The region is served by two 115 kilovolt transmission lines that run parallel to each other. Running through here, it looks like just a single line, but there's actually two that are running next to each other, essentially in the same corridor. The average regional load is about 25 megawatts, so less than a third of the regional load in Humboldt County, so even smaller from that perspective. And there's no local generation source that can carry the local load or the local energy use in the area, which makes the system vulnerable to transmission line outages. And for those who either live in that region or who were paying attention to that, there was a significant issue that occurred there in relationship to wildfire and transmission outage last September. And this picture shows diesel generators in a neighborhood at one of the local substations in Crescent City during that multi-week outage that was caused by wildfire near the transmission lines that supply the area. And so there is a real, not having that generation capacity locally creates a level of vulnerability that is quite significant and goes beyond the reliability issues in the Humboldt area as a result of not having that local generation capacity. Now, when it comes to offshore wind, at this point, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has not yet defined a wind energy area along the Del Norte County coast. This could happen in the future, but that hasn't yet happened. There is, this map is showing, of course, the Humboldt wind energy area, and then there's also the Brookings wind energy area, which was recently defined by BOEM. The power from the Brookings area, if that area is eventually developed, would likely connect into the electrical system on the Oregon side of the border. But it is also possible that a wind area could be identified in the future in the offshore from Del Norte County. If an area is defined, significant transmission upgrades would again be needed to enable interconnection of those wind farms. And if there were a local connection, a connection to the Del Norte County electrical system, or a connection between that new transmission infrastructure and the local electricity system in the Del Norte County area, that could provide fairly significant reliability and capacity benefits to the region. The specifics of what those benefits would depend on the specifics of how things were set up, but having a local connection is one of the key issues. Pivoting back to the Humboldt region, and now starting to focus on offshore wind and the potential for offshore wind development. Our team at the Schatz Energy Research Center, working together with partners, have engaged in 3 major studies focused on understanding the transmission infrastructure needs of offshore wind. That's analysis has covered a number of different scenarios. One of them was an analysis of what would be involved in a full build out of the Humboldt wind energy area. At the time, we assumed that you could install about 1,800 megawatts of wind capacity in that area. And our analysis is based on that. We also did a follow-on study to that where we looked at the possibility of developing a much smaller wind farm in the Humboldt wind energy area, something less than 200 megawatts. And there we were trying to understand what could be done in the absence of grid upgrades, and how large a system could you install without having to upgrade the transmission system. And then more recently, we've done some future-looking studies that try and assess if there were multiple wind farms along the northwestern California and southwestern Oregon coast of varying sizes, what kind of transmission infrastructure would be needed in those cases. And we looked at scenarios that involved multiple different wind areas with between 7,200 and 25,800 megawatts of installed capacity. And the idea there was to really understand from an economic perspective, from a technical perspective, and from environmental permitting and other dimensions, what would be the implications of those different types of systems. All of the work that we've done from these areas is available in reports that have been published through our publications page. And so those can be found at shotcenter.org/publications. Just focusing in on the Humboldt wind energy area for the moment, and thinking about a system that has an output of 1,800 megawatts, or a wind farm that has installed capacity of 1,800 megawatts. That installed capacity is about 20 times the export capacity of the existing lines serving Humboldt County. So large-scale expansion of the transmission system would, of course, be needed to be able to deliver offshore wind to major load centers that would be able to absorb that power. The estimated cost for upgrading a transmission system in our analysis is on the order of $2 to $5 billion, depending on the specifics, with the systems based on more conventional AC transmission lines being towards the less expensive side of things, and undersea high voltage DC transmission being towards the upper end from a cost perspective. And then just highlighting briefly this image on the right. This shows one of the 115 kilovolt transmission lines that serves the Humboldt region passing under a 500 kilovolt transmission line near the Cottonwood area. And we include this image just to show the change in scale between the existing transmission system and the size of the type of transmission system that might be needed in order to support large-scale offshore wind development in the region. And I guess one more note that I'll make on this slide is that we have assumed in the analysis that we've been doing an output of on the order of 1,800 megawatts, or installed capacity of 1,800 megawatts in the Humboldt wind energy area. The offshore wind developers who hold leases have indicated that they think that more wind capacity could be installed in that area, perhaps up to 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts in total. And so that would have some implications certainly for the transmission system. Although if you were to install something of the scale that's shown here, that would be able to carry certainly something on the order of 3,000 to 3,500 megawatts on its own. So as we have done that analysis, we've looked at multiple different options. This is a slide from 2020, so it's a little bit dated, but it shows the same types of routes that are still being considered currently. So one approach was thinking about starting in Humboldt Bay, moving to the east, and then down to the south to bring power down to the Bay Area. Another alternative would be to move from the Humboldt Bay Area down towards the San Francisco Bay Area, following sort of a more southeasterly route. The lines here are just drawn as straight lines. The transmission lines wouldn't necessarily follow those exact routes. They would more likely follow existing rights of way. And then we also looked at two undersea cable routes, one being a nearer to shore route and the other being a further from shore route. And so the analysis at that time was based on that. However you approach things, generally two lines are needed to meet redundancy requirements, although there's some nuance to that when it comes to high voltage DC systems. I think there'll be challenges associated with all of the various routes that could be considered, but the undersea transmission routes from Humboldt to the Bay Area we think would be especially challenging. on the near to shore side of things, there are a number of undersea canyons and associated both geophysical and ecological considerations. If you instead try and avoid that and go further from shore, then you're in very deep water. And that creates its own set of challenges. And then once you're reaching the Bay Area, all of this red down here is marine protected area, and navigating the permitting of getting through a marine protected area with large transmission infrastructure would be, we think, quite challenging. Shifting now over to overland transmission options, I'll begin by emphasizing that specific routes for overland transmission lines have not yet been identified. The most likely possibility might be to follow existing transmission line rights of way, but these rights of way would likely need to be widened because the rights of way are currently set up for the relatively small transmission lines that are in those areas currently, and the transmission lines, larger transmission lines would typically need larger rights of way. Environmental permitting, land ownership, cultural resources, wildfire risk, military mission capability, and cost would all play key roles in determining which eventual routes would be selected, as well as the transmission technology, whether it's AC or DC. All of that would play into selection of eventual routes. And from a timing perspective, large-scale transmission projects often take a decade or more, mainly due to route and permitting related challenges. So these are not projects that tend to happen quickly. From a potential local benefit perspective, as it relates to transmission to support offshore wind, so benefits that could accrue include access to clean energy from offshore wind farms, that with a local connection that would become available in the region. In addition, a connection to that larger transmission system would provide increased access to transmission capacity and could allow for regional load growth. The connection to the new large transmission system would also result in improved electricity reliability due to increased transmission capacity, as well as the associated redundancy of having those additional lines and the connections. And there's also the potential for reduced local air and water pollution from the retirement of combustion-based power plants, or at least the significant reductions in the use of combustion-based power plants. And then there would also be regional jobs and economic activity associated with development of the transmission infrastructure. Most of those jobs would be during the construction phase, although there are some there would be some operational related jobs as well. I think it's useful to go back to the map to be clear about what large-scale transmission lines to the Humboldt Bay region would do and what they would not do. So large-scale transmission lines to the Humboldt Bay area can increase the capacity and improve reliability in that area, in the area around Humboldt Bay. That assumes a local grid connection, and I think it's very likely that a local grid connection would be part of any development to do that. Large-scale transmission would also enable eventual phase out of the, or could enable eventual phase out of the Humboldt Bay generating station. That may not happen initially, but at the very least, it would lead to probably a significant reduction in the use of that generation station. But it's important to note that communities on radial lines that extend from Humboldt Bay would still be limited by the capacity and reliability of those lines and the associated local distribution system. So, for example, there's a 60 kilovolt transmission line that runs out from the Humboldt substation over to Maple Creek and then Willow Creek and the Hoopa Valley, and that ends up serving people in all of this area as well as this area. The reliability issues on that line and the associated circuit depend primarily on that line and the distribution circuits in that area. And so a very reliable set of connections in the Humboldt Bay region wouldn't improve electricity reliability very much in that area. Similarly, looking along the coast, going up through Trinidad and Big Lagoon and Oric, the limitations on that line would not change dramatically with better connections in the Humboldt Bay region, to the degree that outages on that line are caused by issues along that line. And the same would be true in southern Humboldt County and some of the other communities that are served by smaller lines that run out from the Humboldt Bay area. In order to address reliability issues in those communities, other strategies would be needed. They wouldn't automatically be addressed by connection of transmission lines to the Humboldt Bay region. So transmission upgrades can provide a number of benefits, but they don't address all of the issues because the reliability challenges are often caused by issues on the distribution circuits or on those smaller transmission lines. We believe that microgrids and some other energy resilient strategies are the way to approach those sorts of issues rather than thinking of the large transmission upgrades as being a unitary way to address all of the issues. The images shown here show the renewable energy microgrid at the Blue Lake Rancheria, including operation during a regional earthquake that knocked out the grid in the region on December 20th, 2022. The Blue Lake Rancheria was a resilience hub and a center for providing services to many people in the region on that day and on a number of other outages that have occurred over the years since it was established in 2017. And so this sort of technology, I think, can play a key role in addressing reliability and service issues in communities that are remote from the Humboldt Bay region. Another example of a microgrid is the microgrid at the Arcata Eureka Airport, which is shown here. That similarly has performed very well since it was commissioned, including during the 2022 December 2022 earthquake and other outages that have occurred since then. And so deploying this type of technology in additional communities, we believe, has a lot of promise in relationship to addressing reliability and capacity issues on an inclusive basis. With that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Jim Zolik, who's going to talk a bit about transmission planning, the current transmission planning process, and where things stand at the moment. So over to you, Jim.
Great. Thank you very much, Arnie. And maybe I'll give people just a moment to take a deep breath. I know that was a lot of information, but I think a very nice job done by Arnie, laying out a lot of important information. I'm going to take a deep breath. And so the slides I'm going to cover here for the next, I don't know, maybe half dozen slides, focuses on transmission planning in California and the transmission planning process that is currently going on. Transmission planning in California involves three entities. That includes the California Energy Commission, or the CEC, the California Public Utilities Commission, or CPUC, and the California Independent System Operator, also known as CAISO for their acronym. Advance the slide, please, Arnie. The transmission planning process occurs in 2-year cycles. It's actually it's an annual process. So it's an annual process, but each transmission plan occurs over a 2-year cycle. So there's a couple of plans in process at any given time. In terms of the 3 entities involved, the CEC, or California Energy Commission, they produce the Integrated Energy Policy Report on an annual basis, and that develops an electric load forecast that is input into this transmission planning process. The California Public Utilities Commission, they produce an annual report called the IRP, or Integrated Resources Plan, and that document identifies the generation mix that's expected to meet the load, and the load being the load that is generated, the forecast load that's generated by the CEC. Those 2 pieces of information are then input into the transmission planning process, and CAISO does an engineering analysis to determine what transmission infrastructure upgrades are needed to basically deliver the generation resources that are in the generation mix to the load locations throughout the California grid. Next slide, please, Arnie. Thank you. So this shows that process. This is you can kind of see some background, sort of light colored information that's sort of grayed out. That was done intentionally here just to sort of simplify this diagram. So this is for the year 2021 through 2022 as an example of the process. If we start in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the CPUC's Integrated Resource Plan is the blue box. The pink box is the CEC's Integrated Energy Policy Report. Those 2 pieces of information are input into this 2021-2022 transmission planning process, is what the TPP stands for. And the result of that will be a transmission plan. The transmission planning process with CAISO has 3 phases, and those 3 phases are shown here. So the light green box that these other two pieces of information feed into is phase 1, and that is when the study plan is defined for that given cycle, and the UPA is the unified planning assumptions that go into that study plan. You can also see there's a dark green box. This is actually from the previous planning cycle, and the results of that previous planning cycle also feed into the current planning cycle. So we talked about phase 1. Phase 1 then feeds into phase 2. That is where CAISO actually conducts their study plan and develops a transmission plan. There's a public process throughout this process, and that transmission plan is then finalized and sent to the CAISO board for approval. And then once that plan is approved, it goes to phase 3, which is called the sponsor selection phase. This is basically where the CAISO releases what came out of the plan, and it goes to a competitive bidding process. And there will likely be numerous projects that can come out of a given transmission plan. Those projects may be bid separately, and there's a competitive process. And then basically people that develop transmission infrastructure will bid on those projects. Again, a competitive process. There will be bidders selected for award, and then and if that is the case, then that bidder would move forward with the project, and it would need to go through a full CEQA and NEPA environmental review and permitting process. And you can see here, this last box was an example for a transmission planning process that happened in Southern California for a Tehachapi wind project. That was an onshore wind project. This says it was expected to be about 2 to 6 years, and I believe there were some delays, and I believe that ended up being about a 10-year process from the plan to the development of that infrastructure and putting it into practice, which agrees with, I believe, something Arnie said earlier about a 10-year cycle. Next slide, please. This is just a bit more complicated diagram. So we've taken away that the grayed out boxes. So it sort of shows you here that there's multiple, the planning process. There's multiple cycles happening. They're in different phases, but happening concurrently. Next slide, please. So I want to talk now about the 2023-2024 transmission planning process in California. And I'll show you in a moment where we are at in that current process. This 2023-2024 transmission plan is where CAISO is currently assessing transmission needs, well, like they do for every transmission plan throughout the state. You can see the map of the state here and these different regions that are identified. So they do this process on a regional basis and determine the transmission upgrades that are needed in each of these regions. You can see in the upper left, I realize the font is a little bit small, but it says Northern California offshore wind. And the base case is what they're looking at currently. The sensitivity analysis is looking for potential future needs, but the base case is what the plan focuses on. And when they go out to the competitive bid, it's based on these base case designs. And you can see for Northern California offshore wind, it says 1,607 megawatts. So that's a little bit below the 1,800 megawatts that the SHOT Center has been looking at in terms of offshore of Humboldt. But that is the capacity that's been investigated in the planning process currently, and that's for the current Humboldt Wind Energy lease. You can also mention just down in Central California, I think many people are aware, there's also offshore wind project off of Morro Bay being proposed. And you can see here the base amount is 3,100 megawatts being proposed in Morro Bay. So these are all, along with these other generation being proposed in various areas, they're evaluating the transmission infrastructure needed to support these new generation resources. Next slide, please. So focusing in here on Humboldt County and Humboldt wind energy area and this current transmission planning process, the CAISO has been considering several potential transmission pathways. And this includes, some of this was already covered by Arnie in some of the previous slides. So an onshore AC transmission, new infrastructure from Humboldt to which called here the planned Fern Road substation east of Reading. In a couple of one of the earlier slides, I believe there was a substation to the east of us, just east of Reading, in the Central Valley corridor, where Arnie was showing the high voltage 500 kV AC transmission lines. And there is a station close to, I believe it was Round Mountain was the station that Arnie was showing. Fern Road substation is close. It's a planned substation close to Round Mountain. So this would basically connect the Humboldt wind energy area to that same sort of bulk transmission grid in the Central Valley. And then the other two bullets here show the first one, or the middle one, a high voltage DC transmission going to the south to the Bay Area to a planned substation in Collinsville, and that was a route that Arnie also showed going south from Humboldt, and then finally a potential offshore wind high voltage DC transmission line going from Humboldt and then coming onshore around the San Francisco Bay Area, or perhaps as far south as Moss Landing, which is in the Monterey Bay Area. I'll just point out the table in the lower right-hand corner. Basically, this is the capacities for these different types of lines. So a 500 kV AC line, in this case, going to Fern Road. The normal rating for that line is 3,500 MVA. MVA you can consider is essentially the equivalent to megawatts. Volts times amps is watts. So MVA is essentially megawatts. So 3,500 MVA would be 3,500 megawatts. and then there's an emergency rating. And as Arnie noted, and then this shows what the capacities are for a typical high voltage DC, overhead, so onshore, or undersea or underground, down at 2,000 megawatts. And as Arnie noted, when the transmission planning work is being done, it is not sufficient to put in a line that handles the new generation capacity by, all by itself, but you need to take into account what is called contingencies, and you need to build redundancy into the system. So if one line is lost, you don't lose all of that generation. Next slide, please. So here we are in the 2023-2024 transmission plan. This shows in sort of a bulleted fashion here that the same as what I was showing on the flow chart, with a bit more detail. You can see phase one here at the top. So phase one's already been concluded. The developing the study plan. You can see also I have outlined in blue here various public comment opportunities throughout the process. And then phase two is actually using the study plan to develop the transmission plan. You can see this "we are here" arrow, so about 3 or 4 bullets from the bottom. The draft transmission plan has been in development and is expected to be posted publicly on the CAISO webpage on the 1st of April. So, just a few days away. There will then be a stakeholder meeting where CAISO will present the draft transmission plan to the public. Following that public release and stakeholder meeting, there'll be a public comment period that will close within 2 weeks of the stakeholder meeting. So April the 23rd is what's projected. And then once they've gotten public comment, they will make any revisions to the draft plan. They will develop a final plan, which will be provided to the Board of Governors and for approval by the CAISO Board of Governors. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just wanted to share a little bit about a couple of other studies that the SHOT Center, along with other partners that we've been working with on this transmission planning work that are currently in play. So advance the slide, please, Arnie. So the first one I wanted to mention is a study of potential routes for transmission from the Humboldt wind energy area. This is some work. So both of the studies I'm describing here are studies that the SHOT Center is currently involved in. And in both cases, the funding is from the California Energy Commission. And in both cases, the prime contractor is the Aspen Environmental Group. So they are working on behalf of the state of California. And in both cases, for both of these projects, the SHOTS Energy Research Center is a subcontractor to Aspen. So we're partnering with Aspen on this work for the California Energy Commission. This first study is really taking a look at the corridors going from the Humboldt wind energy area, either east to, and now you can see here, these two lines. These are the two existing corridors. These are corridors that we recently looked at in the recent transmission study that we were doing. And then here's the Fern Road substation. The Round Mountain substation is just to the north of that Fern Road substation. And then this new 500 kV line coming south toward the Bay Area. So this is one of the corridors that, at least from Humboldt to Fern Road, that we expect will be part of the CAISO transmission plan. That's the draft transmission plan that's to be released shortly. And then the other would be headed down roughly along the Highway 101 corridor, along, again, the existing transmission pathway that goes down through Sonoma County and down to the Bay Area. We expect that those will be the corridors that are being proposed by CAISO. And so Aspen is doing a deeper dive. It's still a high level review, but they're looking at environmental sort of permitting barriers and potential conflicts, as well as cultural barriers and conflicts that would complicate these corridors being expanded and then utilized for additional transmission to support offshore wind. And we expect the report from Aspen to the CEC and then made public sometime in the next couple of months. And next, advance the slide to the next bullet, please. Thank you, Arnie. So you'll notice the picture's changed here, but roughly the same slide with the second bullet. The second study that we are working on is again with Aspen for the CEC, and also with our partner Quanta Technology that does transmission modeling. So we are doing some additional work similar to the work we just completed, but now focused just on Humboldt County and the well, actually no, Humboldt and Del Norte and the basically offshore wind off of the north coast of California. And what we are looking at is adding energy storage to the mix of offshore wind and transmission upgrades. And there's a couple of reasons that we're doing that. So added energy storage can increase cost. Certainly there's added cost for the energy storage. Whether or not the total cost goes up remains to be seen, because it could potentially mitigate some of the upgrades to the transmission system, but that remains to be seen. But energy storage also offers numerous benefits, and it can offer benefits on the sort of the high voltage bulk transmission system, say at the 500 kV level, where basically power can be stored when power is very cheap or is not really needed, and it can then be dispatched when power is more expensive and more valuable. And that can be a benefit both to the users on the system as well as to the developer that's selling the wind power. And another big benefit is that this energy storage can provide added resilience benefits. And so Arnie talked a bit about the potential resilience benefits that offshore wind and that new transmission infrastructure can provide, and energy storage can be added into that mix as well. And it can be looked at both on a centralized basis. So in the lower right hand corner, you see a large battery energy storage. This is about a 700 megawatt battery energy storage project at the Moss Landing power plant oh, sure, I'm forgetting the name, but anyway, on Monterey Bay. Thank you. So that would be a large scale system, and we'll be looking at things up to that scale, actually probably up to about 1,000 megawatts. And then you can see up above, this is actually a picture of 2 megawatts of battery storage at the airport in McKinleyville, the Humboldt County Airport in McKinleyville, and that is a sort of an example of smaller distributed battery systems. So we'll be looking at both, and a benefit of the smaller distributed battery systems is you can locate them throughout the distribution system. So we could locate some of these battery systems in places like up near the Hoopa substation or down near the Garberville substation, in the places that Arnie was pointing out that won't really benefit from the upgrades that sort of come into the Humboldt Bay area specifically, but those outlying areas don't necessarily share in those same benefits. These battery storage systems distributed in those places could bring some of those same benefits to those locations. I think that's what I have for you today. I'll pass it back to Arnie.
Thank you, Jim. And we'll just close out by revisiting the original key point slide that we started with, which is noting that the wind resource offshore from Northwestern California is a strong one, and wind farms in the region could contribute substantially to state and local climate and clean energy goals. Significant investments in transmission infrastructure would be a prerequisite for development of that wind resource. The transmission upgrades can enable regional benefits, including better electricity reliability, but some communities wouldn't benefit without deliberate steps to ensure inclusive outcomes. And some of the microgrid work and battery storage analysis that we've talked about and that Jim just mentioned are related to trying to understand how to expand that inclusivity. From a historic perspective, Humboldt County's existing electrical system was established in the post-World War II period, and its geographic extent and capacity have not changed substantially since the mid-1960s. And offshore wind provides a generational opportunity for new infrastructure investment. And part of our reason for wanting to share this analysis is to help provide information that people can use to consider how they might want to think about that opportunity, coming at it from all the variety of perspectives that we all carry in our respective communities. And so with that, I think we have reached the end of the presentation phase and would want to move into the Q&A phase of the session. I will therefore stop sharing, although we can go back to the slides if that ends up making sense in the context of the Q&A. And we will move into the Q&A phase. As was mentioned earlier in the session, if you have questions or would like to either make a comment or ask a question, please do that in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer questions up through 2 o'clock, which 2 o'clock Pacific time, which is the timeline for this session. And so I think we have a few questions coming in. I think the first one is that I see teed up is what can community involvement around transmission planning look like? Jim, I wonder if you want to take that question as it relates to the upcoming, or basically just to the state's transmission planning process.
Sure, Arnie. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. It's what can community involvement around transmission planning look like? And so I think part of that question, I think, is what are the opportunities for providing input? Now, there can be other dimensions around what community involvement might mean, but I think part of it is what are the points of providing input?
Right. Yeah. So, as I mentioned in slides I was presenting, it's a cyclical process. So I think getting involved at any point, you have an opportunity to comment on probably a couple of cycles of the transmission plan. Getting involved in the early phase certainly can be helpful. Though the CEC's involvement and the CPUC's involvement, as I mentioned earlier, really has to do with defining the expected load, the forecasted load. That was the CEC's piece, and then the mix of resources to meet that load. That was the CPUC's integrated resource plan. So those are sort of the high level inputs to the transmission planning process. If you're interested to have input, for instance, on what sorts of resources should be utilized to meet the projected load, then you would want to be involved in the IRP process. Or if you were interested in having input, the IPER, the CEC's IPER process is also a policy document. It covers more than just the forecasted load. But so those two processes could allow you to have input on the bigger picture policy of how we plan to meet the load with the available resources. And then once that's settled, the CAISO basically takes that information and then looks at the existing transmission infrastructure and the existing set of resources in terms of generation resources, as well as the existing load, and then what the load is projected to be. They take all that information together and do the engineering analysis to try to determine what different options are available in terms of transmission infrastructure and what the cost of those various options might be, and sort of does a benefit cost analysis. One thing I'll say is that there is not at least to the best of my knowledge at this point in that CAISO transmission process, there's not a great a great sort of opportunity for public input in terms of land use planning and that whole aspect of transmission planning. CAISO's perspective is more of an engineering evaluation. My understanding is, and Arnie, please chime in here, but my understanding in terms of sort of more of the land use aspects, the way the sort of process is currently structured, is that really comes in when I mentioned there would be a competitive bidding process for whatever transmission plan is finalized, and then projects have been determined in that plan to actually be implemented. The CAISO goes out to bid for those projects. When a bidder is selected, then that bidder goes through the full project development, sort of process. And that's where there's a full environmental review and a full, permitting under CEQA and NEPA and all of the jurisdictions that need to weigh in on permitting. There is a proposed project at that point. So, and that developer presumably is trying to get that proposed project approved and then move forward with it. Part of that process, the environmental review process, does require the developer to look at alternatives to the proposed project. So there should be other alternatives. So that does give another place for input. And then I think in terms of the transmission planning process itself, once the load and the resources have been determined, in terms of the process that CAISO goes through, there are a number of public input points, and I tried to point a few of those out in the slide there that I presented. But a couple of public input points during that process where CAISO presents a draft plan or presents a presentation on what the work is that they're doing, and then solicits public input, for a multi-week period, and then they fold that back in to the process and move it forward.
Thank you, Jim. I think there's another related question about consultation, which is there government-to-government consultation involving tribes to discuss routes? And I think my understanding of the answer to that is that the way that the current transmission planning process is structured, there is not a formal element in that process that's set up for that. However, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be the potential for that. I think it's just not set up in the current process. I would encourage tribal governments that are interested in consultation to reach out. They could reach out to the California Independent System Operator, or perhaps to the California Energy Commission or Public Utilities Commission to inquire about those possibilities. And at the same time, we would encourage those agencies to also going forward create such a consultation framework. There's another question, which is about whether the California Independent System Operator would select the developers for an undersea transmission line. If the California Independent System Operator were to select or recommend an undersea transmission line as a preferred approach, then they would then the bidding process would involve that undersea transmission line, and just like overland transmission, the selection process would essentially be the same as we understand it, regardless of whether it's undersea or overland. And so it depends on which of the options that CAISO is studying are recommended for that next step. I will say that I would be surprised at this stage if an undersea route were from the Humboldt region, for example, to the San Francisco Bay Area, were what was was recommended, but it's possible that it could, and I don't think that the process for selection would change uh, um, between an undersea transmission line and an overland one from the perspective of the bidding process. Next question that came in is, should people advocating for transmission solutions benefiting the North Coast be concerned that a sea transmission route, a subsea transmission route, would be more likely than a land route to bypass the North Coast entirely, only bringing power ashore near the San Francisco Bay Area? I don't think that I don't think that I don't think it's likely with existing technology in the relatively near term that would be the case, because in order to bypass any region entirely, you would need to convert from the AC power that is being generated by the wind farm to high voltage DC out in the at sea on a floating platform, in order to bypass the region entirely. And that technology is not yet ready for deployment, and I think is probably maybe a ways off from being ready. And so I think it's much more likely, even if there was a selection of an high voltage DC undersea cable as the route, that the power would first be brought on shore, and then the conversion station would be on shore, and then the undersea cable would be sent back offshore, and that would provide the possibility of a local connection. So I don't think that it's very likely that there would be an option that would be recommended that would not involve a local connection. Next question is, how do differing planning processes work with each other? For example, 1 year, the California Independent System Operator plans for a 500 kV line based off of let's say 1,600 megawatts or something like that. 2 years later, demand expands to 5,000 megawatts. How do those different processes, how do the different processes, and what are the different stages of planning complement or interfere with each other? And I think part of the answer to that is that it's quite important for the planning process to be looking forward and hopefully anticipating some of those sorts of changes, so that new information within just a couple of years would have been anticipated, and would have planned for sufficient capacity in the original plan. That's what you're ideally wanting to think forward in that planning process. With that said, if there were such a change, then I think you would have to build off of that if there was a process already underway in which a bidder had been selected to build a certain infrastructure of a certain capacity, you would have to consider that information in the planning process as you were thinking about requesting additional capacity. Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I don't necessarily have a better answer than that, other than it's really important in the planning process to try and anticipate some of the various possibilities.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things I would add. One is that when I showed the map of California with the different sort of areas where they are looking at new generation and what transmission infrastructure would be necessary in those various regions of the state, there were two capacities that were shown for each one. And one was called the base case, and the other is the sensitivity case. And so that really is part of the transmission planning process, a way for CAISO to set CAISO and others involved in the process to say, okay, here's what we're expecting in the near term, for the current transmission plan. If this ends up being approved and a project goes forward, we'll go out and competitively bid. those things are included in the base case. If they anticipate that there may be additional expansion in the future, but it's not likely to happen in the next few years, then they can add that into the sensitivity case. And so they basically look at both the base case and the sensitivity, and the sensitivity case gives them an idea of what might happen. It's a little less certain, but it's an idea of what might happen in the future, and that can allow them to make adjustments in what they choose for the base case if they think that they need to sort of build in sort of I'll call it like a no regrets policy that would allow expansion in a future situation. The CAISO also does what they call their 20-year transmission outlook. So that's an even the sensitivity case. I'm not remembering exactly how far out they look with that, but I think it might be 10 years or less. Then they do this 20-year transmission outlook. So that's an even more of a futuristic look. But again, just trying to pull information into the planning process so that you're not just going year to year, but also looking forward. The last thing I'll say about this is I do think that the transmission planning process at the state level that we're talking about historically has more or less been used for sort of individual projects where somebody wants to install a new generation, whether it be wind or solar or something else, could be a natural gas plant, et cetera, and they propose it for a certain location, and it needs to, they want to interconnect it. Those things can make their way into the transmission plan, but this right now what the state is looking at with regard, for instance, to offshore wind and with SB 100, where they're really looking at a large scale development of new renewable energy resources to be developed throughout the state and even outside of the state in order to serve the state's load and reach our goals of 100% renewable electricity. You can imagine that's a lot of new generation, and the transmission system wasn't built for that. So you need to reevaluate it and figure out what sort of upgrades and changes need to be made to the transmission system. And so that process is a really big, kind of high level policy process. And I think that, the question you're asking becomes much more important when you look at it in that from that perspective, where, we're not just talking about offshore wind for the next few years. We're thinking that, yes, the next few years we want to get a start on it, but we may be developing this resource over the next couple of decades to really reach our long-term goals. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at the best solution for the near term. We need to keep in mind the long term and try to do our best to not waste resources in the short term, but also be prudent and aware of what we expect in the longer term, so that we sort of have a smooth transition over time.
There's a question that's come in, which is just related to covering the cost of transmission upgrades. So who would fund the $2 to $5 billion cost associated with upgrading the transmission lines? And I think there's two pieces to that. One is who would finance it, and then the other is who would ultimately cover that cost. The developer or the bidder is typically responsible for financing the cost of developing the transmission in cases where you've gone through the transmission planning process and the state has identified that a particular transmission line or transmission infrastructure upgrade is in the interest of the state, which is which would be the case in the recommendation that the California Independent System Operator is going to make, assuming that they recommend proceeding. And so in that case, the bidder would be responsible for financing, but ultimately ratepayers cover that cost in the long term. I think one and that's true essentially of all costs associated with the electrical system, unless it's possible to obtain federal funding to partially offset some of those costs. Ultimately, ratepayers are covering those costs. I think a really important distinction or nuance, though, is that when a particular piece of infrastructure is identified as being in the interest of the state, and so from a policy perspective, it is being recommended. It's the ratepayers across the entire state that are covering that cost, not the ratepayers from a particular region, and so that would be spread across the entire California rate base, and of course, the people living in the Humboldt region or in Northwestern California make up a pretty small fraction of that rate base, so the cost is spread across the entire state. Now, if it's possible to identify federal funding to partially cover some of the cost of those upgrades, then of course that helps to offset how much needs to be covered by ratepayers. Move on to another set of questions. There's maybe a set of questions that came in that relate to environmental impact dimensions. So to move the large transmission towers, will roads need to be widened? And if so, how much old growth will be cut to widen the roads? How many acres of old growth will be cut down to make room for the transmission towers that will be going to the Bay Area with cutting of old growth? How much capacity will be removed for the uptake of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions? And I guess the short story there is that I think the most likely routes that would be followed for transmission lines would be to follow existing rights of way. Those existing rights of way coming out from the Humboldt region mostly do not go through areas that have old growth redwood forest in them, but they do, they do cut through forest land, and it's very likely that there would be a need for some degree of widening of those rights of way in order to accommodate wider. You would need the wider right of ways in order to have the larger transmission lines. In terms of the specific impacts on forests, it would depend on which routes were selected, because there's differences between the various routes when in relationship to that, and some of the assessment, the routing assessment that's being done currently, I think will give some insights into some aspects of those questions. I do think, though, that it would be possible to identify routes that would not involve cutting of any old growth redwood, and at least coming out from the Humboldt region, and of course the environmental impact with second growth or other forest lands would need to be considered in the permitting process. The next question is related to workforce. So what is the state of our local workforce to engage with the transmission dynamics? Will our local small businesses in this field be able to engage with obtaining such contracts? What can we do to increase our local workforce readiness for these potential projects? And there was a related question, which is also about job creation, which is what estimated percentage of jobs would be seasonal or temporary construction jobs, and what would be full-time, long-lasting jobs. I guess the first thing I'll say is that we haven't recently completed a detailed analysis, and we're not aware of one that covers these specific projects, but there is a member of our team who is starting to work on that. Tanner Etherton, who joined our team recently, and we're super excited about that. And so we are at the doing some analysis that I think will speak to these questions that would allow us to answer some of these questions in a more quantitative fashion. We agree that they're important questions. With that said, that without having specific or quantitative answers to those questions, I would say that some of the skill sets that are needed for doing transmission upgrades, I think, are not very present in our region. And so I think it's likely that some of the workforce would come from outside this region. But there's, I think, is likely to be some work associated with these projects that would be suitable for a local workforce. So I think it would be a mix. But from a percentage basis, I think we're not yet ready to answer that, but it is something we're looking into. And Tanner, who is backstage at this event, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free to chime in. But that's my understanding of where we are on that. I guess another question is the center, I think, meaning the Schott Center, doing any research about workforce development in offshore wind in Humboldt? And then the answer to that is yes. As I just mentioned, Tanner Etherton from our team, who joined recently, is helping to lead that work. Tanner joined just last month, and we're really excited to have him on our team, and is helping to lead that effort. There are also other efforts, including activities being led by the county and others here at the university related to workforce related to offshore wind in the region. And there's also some discussions and work that are being led by tribal nations in the region. I know the Blue Lake Rancheria in particular has done some thinking related to workforce in relationship to both microgrids and offshore wind in the region. So there are multiple groups, I think, that are thinking about these issues, and we're doing our best to do that in a coordinated and collaborative fashion. The question about electricity rates. Are electricity rates in Humboldt going to be cheaper as a result of a local grid connection to offshore wind, and who decides that? I don't know that a local grid connection would necessarily affect electricity rates in the region. The electricity rates in the Humboldt region are essentially the same as the electricity rates throughout Pacific Gas and Electric territory. So there's not a differentiation by region, and the rates are essentially set through negotiation between the utility and the Public Utilities Commission. And so a local connection isn't necessarily going to be a deciding factor in all of that. What a local grid connection would do, though, I think, is improve the reliability of the electricity in the region, and it would provide some other benefits. But I think it's likely neither here nor there when it comes to affecting local electricity rates. So here's a question that came in about areas in the Humboldt region that could benefit from a local connection to offshore wind. The question, or the person who asked the question, would like to know whether the benefit in the region would only include Arcata, Eureka, and McKinleyville, while Southern Humboldt, Trinidad, and Orac would not benefit from increased capacity and reliability And if so, which agency decides whether these communities on radial lines are benefiting from hosting offshore wind? And so I guess the first thing I'll say is that it's not that there's zero benefit to communities that are living on in areas that are served by these smaller lines that are running out from the region. It's just that the benefit is, when it comes to reliability and capacity, is limited because by the capacity of those particular lines. And so to the degree that outages are caused by things that are happening in the Humboldt Bay area, those types of outages would be reduced for everyone in the region. But for outages that are caused by issues that are on the distribution system or on the radial lines themselves, having a stronger connection in the Humboldt Bay region would not address that particular issue. And so for communities who for those who live in those communities, the issues, I think, the reliability issues tend to be caused primarily by distribution circuit related issues, and to some degree from the 60 kilovolt transmission line related issues. And a lot of the planning decisions that are made related to that part of the system are essentially carried by Pacific Gas and Electric, the utility, and the California Public Utilities Commission, which is regulating the distribution part of the system. And so transmission planning to support offshore wind is not directly related to that part of the system. We believe that that it's important to find ways of addressing that as we're addressing some of the other issues, and we see microgrids and other similar strategies as being a really interesting way of beginning to think about approaching those sorts of issues. And so we've been moving forward with projects, for example, in collaboration with the Yupa Valley tribe, the Karuk tribe, and the Yurok tribe to develop the potential for a set of microgrid solutions that would help support that circuit. That's something that we see as being potentially replicable throughout the region. But that's not something that, for example, the California Independent System Operator through the transmission planning process would be directly connected to. Those are projects that I think could be developed through collaboration between the California Energy Commission, the California Public Utilities Commission, PG&E, and the respective communities. There is a new program called the Microgrid Incentive Program, or the MIP, which is now a statewide program that PG&E is a part of, that provides incentives for developing those sorts of systems, and that's meant to be an ongoing resource for being able to develop those sorts of systems. And so there is, I think, a recognition of the importance of finding solutions at that scale using microgrids and the investment that is intended to begin to support those sorts of solutions. Another question about the capacity and reliability of smaller lines and distribution circuits out to communities, especially tribal communities. So the question is, why are we not looking at investing in improving the reliability of those systems? Could you expand on the next step to study improvements to energy storage for those communities? Additionally, could you touch on the feasibility of connecting Klamath to the Humboldt Bay grid in addition to the Del Norte grid in order to increase redundancy and reliability? So in a way, I think I began to answer that question with a response to the last question, which is we are looking into the investing in improving the reliability of those systems. And the microgrid work that we've been doing with partners in this region is part of that effort. And currently we're working with the three tribes that I mentioned: the Hoopa Valley tribe, the Karuk tribe, and the Yurok tribe, as well as the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe, on efforts that relate to developing microgrids to support reliability on the circuit that starts with the Hoopa substation and radiates out to serve other communities in the region, and also associated with upgrading the Blue Lake Rancheria system, and have also been in discussion with some others in other tribal nations in the region about microgrid solutions there as well. And there are at a statewide level, the programs like the Microgrid Incentive Program are relevant to that. We are also interested in trying to understand whether or not those sorts of solutions could be relevant in Klamath and some other regions. And so the storage related study that we're engaged in and will be engaged in over the next year is intended to try and understand some of those solutions more fully. I think in terms of a connecting Klamath to the Humboldt Bay grid, I think that's an interesting idea. I think it would be challenging to do that from a routing perspective. Just thinking about the area between Klamath and here along the coast, but certainly would be interested to have additional conversations or thinking about that possibility. I can certainly see the benefit from an electricity reliability perspective, but I would see the routing of the transmission being a challenge. We are coming up on time, and there are a few more questions, but because we're coming up on time, I both want to give people an opportunity to stick with their schedules in terms of what they have coming up at 2 o'clock, and also really want to make sure that we don't close out without acknowledging the fantastic work that some of our team members who are supporting this effort have been doing. So I want to give a big shout out to Maya Kelly, Grayson Adams, and Tanner Etherton from our team who've been supporting this webinar backstage. And also want to give a shout out to Donovan Wakeman, who produced many of the maps that were shown in the slide deck, and has been a mapping specialist extraordinaire for our team. So big thank yous all around there. And just want to note a few things from a next steps perspective, which is that we are planning to post a recording of this session to our website, where we'll do our best to get that ready by the end of this week so that people have that available. We will post that on the shotcenter.org/wind page of our website. If you're interested in receiving updates from us about offshore wind, including reports and upcoming events, please send us an email at windstudies@shotcenter.org, and we'll be happy to put you on our mailing list for that. And just want to thank everybody for joining today and for being interested in this topic. We realized it was a pretty dense session, but also one that only touched a corner of issues related to transmission and issues that related to offshore wind more broadly. And so this webinar is in some ways part of a series that dates back to the year 2020 that we've been engaged in webinars, and we intend to continue to do these types of webinars going forward. And so we'll keep you posted as new webinars are planned. And finally, a big thank you to Jim Zolik, my colleague, for co-presenting, and close out with a a thank you to the Redwood Region Core Hub, who provided sponsorship for this webinar. And with that, Jim, I don't know if you want to say a final word.
Thank you, everybody, for participating today, and we welcome your questions that we didn't get to. And thanks, Arnie, for a great job facilitating and presenting today.
All right, thank you all very much, and look forward to the next one.